Seasons change.
Hi, I'm Greg.
And I'm Betsy.
And we host a podcast called Going on 30.
Each month, Greg and I discuss movies that were nominated or should have been nominated for Best Picture 30 years ago.
Yeah, it's definitely a risky business, but we'd be losing it if we didn't discuss the legend of Oscar caliber movies.
That's a little dramatic, but sure. We give our takes on one movie each month, debate its lasting legacy, and talk about its place in cinema history.
You know, Betsy, in these days of thunder, when far and away a few good men are going through life with their eyes wide shut to the firm hold that The Color of Money has over the film industry, it's just a night and day difference between the beautiful magnolia of the top guns of the business and the oblivion of the edge of tomorrow of American-made franchise.
Okay, all right. I think I threw up in my mouth a little bit. I know what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm having a cocktail while I give you my Minority Report on the War of the Worlds.
Stop it. You are listing just Tom Cruise movies. I'm done.
That is just Mission Impossible. Ghost Protocol.
Okay, so listen to Going on 30 whenever you get the Poppy College beat.
Jerry Maguire, the Mummy. Jack Reacher, the Vanilla Sky Rain Man.
God, you have a deep, deep problem, my friend.
Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Knight, and I like watching, thinking about, and talking about movies and books about movies. One of the great things about starting your own podcast is that there are some days where you actually get to talk to the creators of those movies and books about movies. This is one of those days. This month, I got the chance to interview Josh Larsen, the author of Fear Not, A Christian Appreciation of Horror Movies. Goodreads will ask you, why would anyone want to watch horror movies? Why would Christians in particular bother with the genre? In Fear Not, critic Josh Larsen makes the case that monster movies, creature features, slashers, and other fright films artfully reflect our deep worries in a way that resonates with the Christian experience. Combining critical observation and theological reflection, Larsen devotes each chapter to a different horror subgenre, connecting that subgenre to a commonly shared fear. In addition to considering how the Bible acknowledges and speaks to that fear, each chapter demonstrates how the related themes, narratives, and aesthetics of a handful of films can be viewed through a corresponding theological lens. Reading Fear Not, movie fans will come to appreciate the artistry of the likes of Get Out, The Shining, The Blair Witch Project, The Babadook, Night of the Living Dead, and The Sixth Sense, while also seeing the ways these movies resonate with our fears and, in some cases, hint at God's redemptive comfort. Whew, that's a lot. What I'll tell you is that as a lifelong horror fan, I've frequently felt this tension between this genre of movies that I love and the moral police constantly explaining to me why it's bad. In a genre that leans heavily into violence, sexuality, and the darker impulses of the human condition, those who want to deny the existence of those things tend to take the ostrich head in the sand approach to horror and insist that you do too. Whether it's the Vatican decrying the evil celluloid of The Exorcist, or apparent watchdog groups wringing their hands about the latest release in the Terrifier series. There's no shortage of Christians willing to take an ethical stand between the art and the audience. However, as Josh outlines in his book, should they ever peek between their fingers to look at what's actually on display, they may find films that have quite a bit more to say than the average superhero schlock or faith-based cinema snorefest. Horror can be pretty complex in this day and age, and our reactions to it can be pretty complex as well. Quick bio before the interview. Longtime listeners may remember Josh from when he was on the show several years ago to discuss his book, Movies Are Prayers. By day, Josh is currently a doctoral student in Scotland, something we get into in this conversation. In the world of film criticism, you may remember Josh from his work on the Think Christian website, a reformist look at fandom and faith. He is also one of the co-hosts of the Can't Miss movie podcast, Film Spotting, along with Adam Kempenaar. If you are not subscribed to that pod, you need to rush out and do so right away. Adam and Josh are essentially the new Siskel and Ebert, with the way they artfully and entertainingly discuss the latest releases. So what happens when a film critic writes a book about horror and a horror nerd gets to ask him questions about it? Find out when I keep things under the stole with Josh Larsen. But first, here's Josh reading an excerpt from the book.
For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. These same words could be said by Larry Talbot, the aristocratic Welshman suffering from lycanthropy in 1941's The Wolf Man. After a feral night, the disheveled Talbot wakes up in his bed, baffled by the muddy paw prints on the sill of his open window, yet knowing deep down that they lead to him. Talbot is stuck between two selves, much like Paul, who also wrote, "For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing." That's what Larry Talbot fears. What we all fear. Fear of our own capacity for sin can be found throughout the classic horror films distributed by Universal Pictures from the 1930s to the 1950s. Titles such as Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Invisible Man, and my personal favorite, Creature from the Black Lagoon, all function as monstrous mirrors. Give the Wolfman a shave, unravel the mummy's wrappings, make the Invisible Man visible, and what do we find? Ourselves. Doing not what we know we should do, but what we know we should not.
So my first question is really, I think, simple. Whenever it comes to horror movie, it's such a specific genre. Were you always a fan of this genre, or did you learn to appreciate it through your role as a film critic?
Probably yes to both, in that becoming a film critic allowed me to understand not only the initial pull it had on me when I was very young, but then also the deeper significance, the impressive aesthetics of the genre, which is often thought of as just schlocky, and the deeper resonance and meaning. All of that came later, when I was older and thinking about movies more seriously and wanted to apply that to the horror genre, which has, unfortunately or fortunately, had a hold on me since I was way too young. I think probably, it's hard to put an age on it. It was that young, but it was really getting to see horror movies edited for TV. So not, pure form, but at these gatherings, I write about this in the introduction to Fear Not, these intergenerational gatherings my extended family would have on Sunday nights. So we were still going to church on Sunday nights in those days. And then my mom's aunts would take turns having everyone over to their house. And it would go well into the evening. School the next day was not a concern for them. They were just talking away, and all the cousins were left to do whatever we wanted, which for the oldest of us eventually meant, seeing what's on TV. And that's when I came across something like The Shining for the first time, something like Psycho for the first time. And obviously a very particular viewing experience, broken up by commercials, edited for content, cousins jumping all over me. But still, man, those things scared me.
I mean, they so imprint on the mind. I'm thinking of even non-horror examples will make an imprint. I remember watching Star Trek II, and the thing crawls into Chekhov's ear. When Khan releases those things into their helmets, and I screamed and ran out of the room. I was maybe 6 or 7. Yeah,
yep.
It has such a hold over you.
That one worked on me too. Imprint is exactly the word. Yep, that's how it feels when I think about some of those early horror titles that I saw.
You use the word schlocky which I think is part of the history of the genre. It's just such a cheap medium. Like it's such a cheap way of making a movie, the horror genre itself. And we can talk more about that later. But it also, as a result, I think gets a bad rap critically.
Mhm.
And so I wonder, like, is there approaching this as a film critic, and then we'll get to the sort of religious stuff later. Is there a predisposition to sort of downgrade horror offerings in the critical community just because they kind of feel cheap?
I think that was a stronger position or more widely felt years ago. I think now horror it's been through so many permutations and had these landmark legitimate titles like The Exorcist or Silence of the Lambs, that nowadays I think that reputation has faded a bit. It's almost gone the other way, where there are folks, I'm not among them, who complain about quote unquote elevated horror and say horror has become, too ponderous, too much involved with meaning, too worried about its characters' past traumas. Let's get back to the schlock. We've kind of we've swung that way, but certainly
Right.
for many decades it had that reputation, and partly was deserved. As you say, this is, it was a cheap way to make movies. It
Mhm.
was a guaranteed way to find an audience because it was an established genre with certain rules. The audience had expectations that if a producer made a movie that met those expectations, they could be guaranteed a return, a financial return. And it didn't cost a lot of money to make movies like this. Now, that afforded, to my mind, a lot of freedom for exciting young filmmakers who, as long as they stayed within the genre lane,
Mhm.
they could then experiment formally and take some risks with how these movies looked, what they did, what the camera did. And that, I think, is what started to excite me as a critic. But yeah, we've been through this, trajectory of those early schlocky movies, and there are a ton of bad cheapo horror, undeniably.
Mhm.
And then a lot of copycat horror too, I think, is a part of this. Cheaper knockoffs, right, is a staple of the genre. You don't see that quite as much in historical costume period pieces, right? You don't get the cheap knockoffs. You do in horror. So that's a part of it too. But yeah, we have kind of come through this period of horror getting so much respect. You have people who say, get me back to that schlock. That's what I really liked.
Yeah, one of our spinoff pods that we do for our show is a show called Going on 30, where we go back 30 years and look at movies that were nominated for Best Picture and ask our questions like what's the lasting legacy of this movie and stuff. And I was shocked to see when we went back to Silence of the Lambs, like what kind of criticism it was receiving from like Siskel and Ebert, for instance, who were sort of
Hmm.
not really fans of this. And
Hmm.
it was one of those questions of, is this a holdover because they had to watch all those Friday the 13th and Hellraisers like leading up to this movie, and they just couldn't appreciate it for the violence and the sort of stalkery
Yeah.
stuff that's in the movie. Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, that's surprising to hear. I don't remember particularly what their objections were. I would have guessed they were with, the more firm critical establishment that really praised that movie and led it to get even Oscar attention. That was a real case of horror breaking through to the mainstream. Though, of course, you'll also have horror people who say Silence of the Lambs is not a horror movie. It's
Right.
more akin to a thriller, a serial killer movie. These lines blur, and I don't usually take strong stands in these arguments.
Mhm.
I step away from them. But to my mind, it is an example of that sort of material receiving establishment approval that has kind of paved the way for this more recent period of talented filmmakers actively wanting to work in the genre. Jordan Peele, maybe
Yep.
one of the prominent examples of recent years. And Get Out is, another instance of receiving establishment approval for a very much clear horror title.
Let's switch gears over to where your book comes in, which is this idea of, a Christian appreciation of horror, right? It's this like the idea of there is this, and you give voice to this in the book, This idea that there's a tension between the genre itself and some forms of Christianity, in that there's sort of a skepticism from Christian churches towards this particular genre. Recognizing that I want people to read your book, could you just speak to what are a couple of the things that seem to be the reaction on the Christian side towards why horror is problematic?
I mean, I have to be honest and understand some of those objections because there is an exploitative thrust to a lot of horror. It goes back to those cheap, schlocky roots that we were talking about. Among the genre elements that a producer needed to promise an audience when it comes to horror, in a lot of cases, is violence, absolutely, physical and psychological, and frequently sexual violence or sex is some element of the story. And there's no denying that a lot of horror exploits those two elements in ways that Christians can rightly, I think, say are, do not make for good art, let alone something that a Christian would want to engage with when art or a movie is exploitative like that. That being said, I don't see that as a reason to cast off the genre completely. And as a matter of fact, if we look to the Bible, we see models of horror, though the Bible isn't discussed that way, across Scripture. Now, another objection I get, to move back to that, is often when I'm having this conversation, someone will point out Philippians 4, verse 8. Whatever's true, whatever's lovely, whatever is admirable, all these qualities. And they'll say, if this is what we're supposed to be seeking out, why would you watch horror, which admittedly does not contain things that would be described as lovely, right? And I can go into, how you read that text from Paul and how, to my mind, he's not writing that to a church as an admonition saying, because you've been doing this bad stuff, here's what you should be doing. Instead, it's more of a celebration and an encouragement. And you could take some of those terms and even apply them to art and say, art well done is admirable, and art done in a way that pursues justice. And I write about a prophetic horror, a subgenre pursuing justice. You could say that is right, whatever is noble. So I do think even some of those qualities can be applied to horror. But the larger story of the Bible, to go back to that, horror is all over it. There is murder. There is, we will see demons in the Bible. We will see stories of body horror. And I believe one reason that is in the Bible is because the Bible is honest about the state of our fallen existence, fallen humans in a fallen world. And you can't describe that without being honest about it. And the reason the Bible describes it is to then offer the hope of the gospel, right? The Bible doesn't just drop the hope and not tell us why it's needed. And so I do think that horror as a genre is in that place of recognizing what makes us afraid and being honest about it, and then offering the gospel as a response to that fear. The title of the book, Fear Not, it's taken from, such a common phrase throughout the Bible.
Right.
Well, why is that there? Because there are things to fear. And that's also in the Bible. So it seems quite reasonable and obvious to me that horror movies have the potential to function in the same way that horror in Scripture does.
I love that train of thought because it also gets at how we extrapolate meaning from Scripture. This idea of exegesis, right? Pulling meaning out of the text. I'm thinking specifically of places in the New Testament where the story itself is set up as a horror story. So like Jesus sending the demons into the swine and they run off the cliff. That's a very sort of horror tropey story. And
absolutely, yeah.
And the thing that really sort of melds it to this idea that you're talking about, horror, is that horror movies are rarely about the thing that they're showing on the screen. They're about some sort of subtext that lies beneath, right? So it's like Frankenstein isn't about a monster. It's about what does it mean for a human being to try to create the way that God creates, right?
Yep.
Like all of these things are sort of underneath the surface of the movie itself. And the more horrific sort of stories that we see in the New Testament are often ones that seem sort of impenetrable to meaning, like swine falling off of cliffs, or Peter sinking, in the water during a storm. It's like, what are we supposed to draw out of these stories? And that really wrestling with those things. Yeah.
Yeah, and that speaks to the way I structured the book, actually, is you're right that in horror, it stands in so much, the actual monster will stand in for something else. And so I look at all the different subgenres of horror and asked myself, okay, what common fear does this subgenre generally explore? So I'll go back to prophetic horror, and that is fear of societal evil. So these social structures that are evil, and those are often represented in horror movies, like, to go back to Peele, Get Out, or his follow-up film Us. But we have, slashers, I suggest, explore a particular fear. Zombie movies explore a particular fear. And that was a lot of fun to do, to think about these subgenres in that way. And then also take the theological step and say, okay, where's that fear show up in the Bible, and how is it perhaps met in the Bible as well? Not that that's always necessary. I do think there's a theological value in just acknowledging that we're afraid of these things, because, again, that's what Scripture does, and it gives us that outlet. That it does seem to me that the articulation of fear is a more Christian response than the repression of it. And to repress horror as a genre is not, I would say, spiritually healthy. That doesn't mean every Christian needs to watch horror, not at all. But I think we do have the freedom because it does offer these benefits.
That's such an interesting point. I wonder, when you say that, what I think of is that sort of that ingrained Christian value that's been inherited of a value for stoicism. And horror doesn't allow you to sort of be stoic. It is trying to incite and like a visceral response from you, right? And
absolutely.
So there's something at odds there, where like the Christian ascetic is like, I will not allow fear to get to me, and then the jump scare comes on the screen, and you're like, I let it get to me again.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, as a virtue, I guess I am arguing for the virtue of, within a safe context, being afraid.
Yeah. Although I have had several, it's funny because I think that there's two different ways to think about this. One is sort of this evangelical Christian understanding, or maybe even like Roman Catholic understanding, because I'm thinking about their response to The Exorcist, for instance, or something, where it's like, oh, there's just something inherently evil about this genre because it just plays, it plays in the dark sides of humanity, and we're trying to work in the other fields. And so I think that is a critique. But then there's also another critique from friends of mine who are progressive thinking, working in the religious communities and stuff like that. But they still say, like, I don't like it because I just don't like the way it makes me feel. And I don't know that it's making other people feel good either,
Yeah, and this is a little bit getting into the discernment conversation as well. And goes back to what I was saying about the value I believe is in the genre for Christians doesn't mean that all Christians need to watch horror. I mean, if you are enduring some of this sort of trauma that these movies explore in your daily life, absolutely, I can understand why do I need more of that by sitting down and watching a film that could potentially be harmful to you, actually. And so I would respect that. So it does make it a bit of a personal discernment question. I get more nervous when it swings to the point of not only writing off the genre forever, but legislating against it for everyone for religious reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. Boy. And that's, gosh, we just had a long conversation on our main pod about corporate interest in media, and as these conglomerates start to buy up more and more studios and media properties and stuff, like what then are they allowed to dictate to you as, well, this is appropriate entertainment and this is not? I feel like it's just such a, it feels like such a fraught space, especially nowadays with so much money floating around from Amazon and Skydance and stuff like that.
And the capitulation we see from some of those companies to an administration in power. Yeah, very scary times on that front.
Yeah. Swinging over to all the different aspects from like monster movies, zombie movies, body horror, all of this stuff. I wonder, just personally, was there one that you kind of had your own fear of before you went into that particular subgenre? Was there one where you're like, oh, I'm gonna have to watch The Fly, or like I'm gonna have to watch, something that I just kind of personally like react to?
Great question. I think my honest answer would have to be either psychological horror, which I propose explores our fears of our anxieties, or found footage, actually. And it might be found footage that scares me the most because frequently it's doing it on, for me, very visceral terms where, psychological horror is more emotional terms for me, I find. And at a certain point, I can intellectualize my emotions and say, well, this is, really stirring me up because, it echoes this particular anxiety I have in my life. And as a defense mechanism, I start to intellectualize them. So even though psychological horror is scary for me, I think the ones that slash through that defense mechanism of intellectualizing is found footage. And by that, I'm talking about, the masterpiece of the genre, The Blair Witch Project from 1999, this movie that purported to be, upon its release, just video footage people found in the woods of 3 student filmmakers who went out to make a movie about the legend of a witch and never came back. And what's on the video is snippets of their filming, their camping, that sort of stuff. So after that, you get something like Paranormal Activity. You get something like REC, REC. And yeah, Blair Witch is probably, to me, one of the more terrifying films I've seen because so much of the horror it's just formal. It's these glimpses of the woods at night that their camera caught. We hear sounds. We can't see what it is. Then the camera shuts off. Then we'll get glimpses of something else from a day later. And there's something visceral for me about that. That was also, interestingly, the hardest chapter to write about because I was trying to figure out what is the fear that these sorts of movies capture.
Yeah.
And what is the theological resonance to that?
Yeah, and then you get into the whole marketing angle of it. I remember like being in college when Blair Witch came out, and it was an event because we had been primed for it to be an event because it had been leaked online, like leading up to the release of the movie, and so which was part of the marketing for it. Yeah.
It was incredibly clever, and it premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. And for the people who saw it there, at least in its first couple of screenings, they were told, as I said, listen, we've got this crazy documentary that someone has put together from this found footage. So the original audiences at Sundance did not know that this was a fiction film. And it was a huge hit at the festival. And the distributors, when they picked it up, decided to run with that for the marketing campaign. So if you were not following festival coverage or reading critics, and you just saw an ad for the Blair Witch Project and liked horror and went to see it, for the first probably, half a year after its release, and I think it ended up being released the summer of 1999, most audience were under that same, impression that they were watching a documentary. And then, of course, word started to spread. This is, as you said, dawn of internet age. So things, you couldn't do this today, right? You wouldn't, this wouldn't work. But then it was still able to keep this under wraps to a degree. Now, I, as a working critic at the time, knew about it by the time I saw it, but man, it still worked on me. It didn't matter.
Absolutely. Because, one of the things, even though, you have the book section and the subgenres, and I think in our minds we tend to section these things out into subgenres. They do bleed together. Like there is a
Absolutely.
conversation between these different aspects of horror. Like for instance, with Blair Witch, it's like there's an inevitability to the fact that nightfall is going to come. Like they can't stop the world from spinning. Like the night
Yeah.
is going to keep coming back and keep coming back. And that's not unlike what Wes Craven was playing with the Nightmare Before Elm Street series or Nightmare on Elm Street series, where it's like you're gonna have to go to sleep at some point. It's
gotta
just
go to sleep.
inevitable, right? Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. That's a great connection. And Nightmare on Elm Street was probably, another one of those. I saw that when I was an older kid. That very concept terrified me.
Yeah.
Just this idea of like, if you fall asleep, you're vulnerable. And you're right. It's such a great point about the subgenres connecting with each other, because I could have put Nightmare on Elm Street in the found footage subgenre, because the fear that I did end up narrowing in on for found footage was very simple. And you just touched on it. Fear of the dark. It's, as you say, when they're out camping, weird things happen to them the first night. Nothing too scary, just weird. Second night gets a little more intimidating. Third night, it's like things are really going down. So it is this fear of the dark. And what I connected this with other found footage, like Paranormal Activity is not camping, but things go down while the characters are sleeping in their house, right? They put up a video camera to try to figure out what it is. All of these movies to me capture this sense that we want to know, but we can never fully know, despite our desperate attempts, everything. And this is heightened when we feel vulnerable. We want to be omniscient like God, and we turn to technology to give us this. In the Blair Witch Project, they use their cameras to see what's out there, what's making the noise. And you can't see it because it's too dark out there, or because the frame can't capture it. Right. And this is what's so formally exciting about found footage is really smart filmmakers use the limitations of pretending like this stuff has just been found to manipulate the audience by keeping things we're so desperate to see just outside of the screen. And so I do think this ties to this existential fear of not being able to have all the answers as finite humans. And Fear of the Dark is just one example of that.
I love the way that you use that word vulnerability, because that's what you see on the screen, right? It's like during Paranormal Activity, it's like you set up the camera and then what you're watching is that your body is vulnerable to whatever can come out of those dark spaces.
Yes.
And you can't do anything about it. That's so perfect. One quick thing, just to go back to, we've been talking a lot about sort of horror tropes. So like, fear of the dark, fear, and you do this in the book too, where you talk about what is the sort of uniting fear that exists for each of these subgenres. Horror tropes can show up in lots of movies that don't necessarily identify themselves as horror. One of the ones that I often point to as a movie that really follows the outline of a horror movie is Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. And,
sure.
And I mean, it follows the rules of a horror movie. And yet when you talk to evangelical Christians, conservative Christians about that, they're like, oh no, this is like a devotional film. This is nothing like a horror movie. But if you really think about it, it has more in common with The Exorcist than it does The King of Kings. Do you think that that's an intentional choice from the creator to make something that is going to draw people in the way a horror movie does? Or is this just one of those just weird, creative quirks that just comes out in a different way? Yeah.
There's a lot to talk about there. I mean, we could talk about it within I don't want to say a theology of suffering, because I think it's very problematic in a lot of ways, but a philosophy of suffering that I think Mel Gibson, director of The Passion, has long been fascinated with. If you look at many of his films as an actor, even very mainstream entertainment genre action films, there are frequently scenes of his character enduring extreme physical suffering. And I'd have to pull up his filmography to see some exact titles, but I'm sure scenes are coming to mind where he's either captured and being tortured, or
I can think immediately of Lethal Weapon 2 when he puts his shoulder out of socket in order to get out of
exactly.
in order to
Yes.
get out of the straitjacket. Yeah.
So that's one thing to consider, is that the Passion of the Christ is the epitome of this obsession, I would call it, Mel Gibson has had with physical suffering as a path towards spiritual purity. Is how it is definitely presented in The Passion. And I think you could argue, even in some of those action films, in terms of his character's trajectory, he sees it that way. So there's that way to understand The Passion. There is the devotional aspect, which I don't want to entirely discount, even though that movie, I find it very difficult to enter into that movie in that way. And part of it is, I think, my awareness of Gibson's past films, and I'm bringing that to the movie, whereas someone who maybe has never seen a Mel Gibson movie goes to The Passion strictly as this a Jesus movie, understanding it's going to be a graphic take, may find there is a devotional value to it. Don't want to entirely discount that. Now, to bring it back to our horror question, I could have easily, if I wanted to open this can of worms, and you can already see why I didn't want to my mind, put The Passion in the body horror subgenre.
Yeah, with Cronenberg and stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. But this gets complicated, right? Because my theory there is that body horror is all about our fear of, I call it this mortal coil, but you could just say our mortality, the fact that we are in bodies that break down. That is one of the base human fears. Now, this gets complicated by including The Passion in there. The reason I would is because it contains exactly the sort of graphic depiction of flaying flesh that most body horror does to one degree or another. You mentioned Cronenberg, so think of something like The Fly, right? You mentioned Hellraiser before. I would say that's an interesting play on body horror as well. The Passion, it gets complicated because at the one time, Christ as fully human is experiencing mortality and all of the pain and horror and fear that comes with that. At the same time as being fully God, he is defeating mortality and overcoming it and pushing through it. So in that sense, it doesn't, to me, really work as body horror. But it's where I would have to place it if I did.
I want to get to what comes sort of after your book, which is like the innovations of the genre. You've already given voice to a lot of this, the way that the horror genre has sort of reached an elevated state, I think, because young filmmakers, it's just an easy way for them to get into the business. So, over the last few years, just thinking of things like Hereditary or Midsommar or Get Out or even Barbarians, Weapons, like all of these late, these movies that have come recently that are critically acclaimed and also still sort of embrace horror, embrace the foundational aspects of the genre. Let me start with this, and it comes to the innovations. In the 70s, we had like Giallo horror, stuff like that. I mean, very bright blood. Like, we had the limitations of technology, right? Tom Savini made gross things, but they were still like gross in movie terms. And nowadays, I feel like there can be a reaction to horror just at the base level of how it looks and the realism of it, I think can sort of really start to affect people. Slasher genres like the Terrifier franchise, or even, some of the stuff that shows up in Hereditary, it looks frightening. And I wonder if we're, through AI, through just special effects innovation, is there a point where we reach that it's too real going forward, or it looks too real going forward?
You're asking someone who finds the more technology employed in cinema in general, not that I'm against it, but the more it's employed, the more heavily it's employed in cinema in general and horror in particular, I find it less affecting. So when I think it goes back a little bit to the Blair Witch Project, which had no special effects budget whatsoever, but used the basic elements of cinema, camera movement, light and dark, sound, editing choices to terrify me, like very few films have. Now, if they had cleaned that up through some sort of, CGI scrubbing to make the images a little more pristine, dropped in an actual CGI Blair Witch at any moment, to me, that would have been completely lost. A completely pointless exercise. I think the experience would have been lost. The effect would have been far less for me. So I don't know the way I experience movies, if that's going to make them too real. It might send them into a realm, as I would argue has happened with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, of CGI meaninglessness.
Yeah.
And that's not very scary at all. So yeah, that would be my concern in terms of increased in technology and effects as applied to the horror genre. I mean, you mentioned weapons, and which employs special effects. And this is a film that just came out this summer, but there is nothing more unsettling to me in that movie, which includes also some gore and things like that, than the defining image of these young kids who have mysteriously, at I think it's like 3 a.m, left their houses, run out the front doors with their arms down to their sides, streaming down these dark streets. That's an image that, for the most part, I don't know exactly what filmmaking techniques were used, but is relying on pretty basic filmmaking techniques. And I've argued, when we've discussed it on the Film Spotting podcast, I think that's a horror image that's going to be everlasting in the genre. People will think of that image 20 years from now, where they think of, the priest at the foot of the stairs in The Exorcist, or they think of the twins in The Shining, or the blood rushing out of the elevator in The Shining, or, Psycho, the shower. I think those kids running like that, very little special effects used to that. So I guess that's kind of where I'd land on that question. But I'd almost want to hear more from you about, it seems like it is something that the realism is more of a concern for you in altering the experience.
I just wonder what it does to us. It's one of those, I'm currently reading a book. It's this book called Son House. And one of the characters talks about, sometimes there's shadows to the way that generations approach the world around them. And there's sort of a built-in irony to Generation X and millennials, where we've been marketed to so much that we just kind of have irony glasses on for everything. And if everything feels like a scam, then it's hard to find meaningfulness in the world, right? It's hard to find authenticity, like that something can actually be truly good and not have like something behind it. And I guess that's kind of the sense that I'm getting at with Too Real, is like, if I can create a movie that can show step by step, like, death and gore and all of these things, then it's like, am I numb to the effects of what that movie is trying to tell me?
Sure. And that's a critique that I think has been around questions of sex and violence in movies since the beginning, really. And at what level of exposure can lead to that sort of numbing you're talking about. A spiritual numbing, perhaps even a societal numbing, then how we interact with people. Kind of brings me back to the discernment question too, is that I do believe that's possible for people. I don't believe that we're just robots that are unaffected by these things. But again, that does not mean it. We need to legislate the movies away to prevent that. I think it's more of a personal discernment question. And on something like this, it's also, I always say that discernment needs to be done in community too, because we always think we have a hold on what we can quote unquote handle, or what's not harmful to us psychologically or spiritually. But, we lie to ourselves about that sort of stuff on what we eat every day, let alone
Mhm.
let alone these deeper these deeper things. So we need to do it in community where people will be like, "Why are you watching that?" You know,
Yeah.
not like you should not watch that, but just that sometimes that little question can be enough. Like, why are you watching that?
Yeah.
It's like that. Oh, if someone walks in the room and it's and it'll make you pause and say, "Why am I watching that?" And you could come up with a very good justifiable reason, and maybe you can't. And then it's you know, a moment to give that some more thought and feed into your future viewing choices.
Yeah, the feeding analogy is a perfect example because that brings up the phrase "you are what you eat," and I think that that is true of what we watch as well. Like, you know,
Can
if you are
be,
giving
yeah.
yourself a constant diet of conspiracy theory and like
Yeah,
suspicion
I mean, we've
of
absolutely seen that for
yeah,
sure.
then it frames the way that you see the world around you. Yeah, so. One last question for you on the future of this genre. We've already brought up a bunch of titles. Get Out, The Substance last year, nominated for Best Picture. Sinners this year. I mean, again, like we're getting into like what's horror, what's not. I think a movie with vampires has horror elements, certainly,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. That one
Um,
kind of like turned into a horror about halfway through or so, right?
yeah, like, likely Sinners will be nominated for Best Picture this year at the Academy Awards. One of the things that Betsy, my co host for Going on 30, and I always talk about is that the Oscars are not the best movies of the year. It's a promotional tool for the industry to lift up, certain artists, certain craftspeople, and sometimes it's lift up certain properties because it's like we want more of these movies to get made because that means that we'll have more jobs going forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder when things like The Substance are getting nominated, when things like Sinners are getting nominated for Best Picture, is that indicating that there's probably a spot for a Best Picture horror movie every time the nominations come out? Like that's something that we can probably look to for the future.
I will never understand how The Substance got nominated for Best
I
Picture. And
I do
I
not
say that
understand it. I love the
I say that
movie.
as someone, yeah, who
Yeah.
appreciated the movie. I didn't think it was, among the best of the year, but I did appreciate it. Pure body horror. Wow. Yeah, that one's still confusing to me. Sinners, something like Sinners makes a lot of sense. It has other things the Academy generally looks for, which is a period setting, um, established filmmakers who have, if not been explicitly nominated for Oscars already in previous films, but in that conversation, and audience embrace. That's usually important, is that a movie makes money. To your point, these are industry awards, and also what was the other? Oh, critical, a level of critical appreciation.
Hmm.
Hollywood holds critics at a distance, but at the end of the day, they want to be praised. They want
Yeah.
their movies to be praised. So Sinners, I think, yes, I would agree it's a horror movie, and also conveniently for the Oscars conversation, checks a lot of those other boxes.
Hmm.
I think for horror to become a regular fixture at the Oscars, more likely than not, it's going to have to be something like that. This is why The Substance befuddles me. We could have a long conversation about theories as to how that got into the race. But I think it was an outlier. And I think normally you need something like, again, if we go back to talk about Silence of the Lambs, there was a pedigree to the
Hmm.
people involved there. Absolutely. And it was also dancing those genre lines a little bit, like Sinners did. Get Out is perhaps maybe a little more in that an anomaly category, and is maybe more of a Substance like Best Picture nominee, which is interesting. So, yeah, although we've thought of two examples that break the rule, I don't think we're going to see horror every year at the Oscars unless it manages to appeal to those voters in a few other ways as well.
Yeah. Okay. So could be a pattern. We'll just have to see, like going
Could
forward.
be.
Yeah. Yeah. Josh Larson, thank you so much for coming on. Fear Not, a Christian appreciation of horror. You can find it bookstores, Amazon. Are you an Amazon promoter? for buying?
Yeah,
your books?
you can get it there, but folks who are trying to not, I always point them to bookshop.org, which is a great place that with every purchase does help out independent booksellers as well. So that's it's not an option for everybody, but if you have that option, you can find the book there as well.
Excellent. And we've had you on for Movies or Prayers. We've had you on for this one. Do you have another book in the works?
Oh man. I'm at this point just trying to keep up with homework. I'm pursuing a master's in theology and the arts at the University of St. Andrews. So a lot of readings to do. Haven't even started with the papers that we have to write and other presentations. Those are right around the corner. So not thinking books at all at the moment, though I do really enjoy writing them and hope at some point I get an opportunity to do another one.
Well, enjoy all that haggis while you're out there at St. Andrews
Have not
in Scotland.
taken the leap into haggis yet. It's been a month, so I'm probably overdue since we've been here. I know it's going to have to happen, but that looks like we're talking Blair Witch level scares to me.
Yeah, there you go. That's a whole nother fear not. Yeah, the Scottish delicacies.
Lots of other great food here, though. I will say, lots of other great food I've enjoyed.
Josh Larson, thank you very much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Greg. Enjoyed talking to you.